So hi, everybody. Welcome to the virtual talk, The Curious Life of Canada's First International Oil Baron. My name is Christina Sidorico. I am the Education Program Coordinator here at the Oil Museum of Canada, National Historic Site. I will be your moderator tonight for this presentation. I'm going to begin with some background information about how to use Zoom and how to interact with us during this webinar format. We've done this a couple times before, and we really seem to enjoy it. So you can use the chat box to talk with other webinar attendees or to make any comments. I will be monitoring the chat, so please keep it civil and appropriate for a public forum. If you want to send a message to the whole group, you have to select all attendees. If you just want myself to see the message, please just select Oil Museum of Canada or Lambton County Museums. To get the chat started, you are welcome to share where you're from. So the chat is open. You can put where you are joining us from today. If you're joining us in Sarnia, Lambton, are you joining us from Chatham, from Windsor, from Ottawa? Where are you joining us today? So please say hello and where you're from in the chat. I'll be able to see it and we can share a little bit for where everybody's from. If you have a question that you would like answered, hello from Petrolia. If you have a question, feel free to put the question into the Q&A. So they're at the bottom of your screen. There is a Q&A section. It's got two little chat boxes. So please put a question in there. I will be able to see that question and I can relay that to Gary when it is appropriate. I'll be recording the presentation tonight. So you've heard that this presentation is being recorded. This is our third virtual talk, and I want to take a moment to introduce the Oil Museum of Canada. Some of you may know about us, some of you may not know about us. So the Oil Museum of Canada is a designated National Historic Site situated in the historic oil fields of Oil Springs, located in Ontario's first Industrial Heritage District, and recognized under the Ontario Heritage Act. The museum preserves and interprets the history of Lambton's innovation and global contributions to the oil industry. It did get its start here in 1858. However, we do know that the oil resources that were harvested here were also harvested by the Anishinaabe, the peoples of this traditional land. The main exhibition center of this site was constructed in 1960 and houses over 9,000 artifacts that interpret the history and influence of Lambton's proud oiled heritage. In 2001, after a very long renovation, we started a renovation project that closed our doors for a year. It was a terrible time, very dusty, but we are very excited that through capital improvements, we were able to replace aging equipment, building systems that were beyond their life cycle, and refresh the exhibition gallery with more interactive displays. We really encourage you to come visit us here at the Oil Museum. I'm here. I would love to see you and meet you. Due to significant challenges relating to the supply of materials and the availability of trades, it required us a long time to complete the extensive work. The doors are now open and we are ready and waiting for you to come visit us. Today, I am so proud to introduce Gary. Gary is a retired newspaper editor and history buff from Grimsby, Ontario. His interest in the early Canadian oil developed in the 1970s while he was a young reporter at the London Free Press Sarnia Bureau. It was during this stint that he learned about petroleum, oil springs, and the incredible stories of the petroleum era. So later he went to work for the Ottawa Citizen, and years after he returned to Southwestern Ontario, and Gary's first petroleum book, Hard Oiler, is on sale here at the Oil Museum of Canada. And it will be followed by several others. And during that time, Gary never stopped thinking about William McGarvey, and he was determined to track down the full story. And the story is not that easy to track down. As a person who works at the museum, who's interested in this topic, I can't state how difficult tracking down all this information is. Gary is a fountain of knowledge that we just can't wait to hear about it, because I've been digging into this story and the story travels the world. And I can't read Polish or some of the other documents that many of the story's elements are contained in. So Gary's book, the new book, Crude Genius, will be out later this spring. He lives in Windsor with his wife, Linda, and we are so happy to have you here. And you can purchase a copy of the book at the Oil Museum when it is finally published. We can't wait to get our little hands on it and snuggle up with a book this summer to enjoy the nice weather. So thanks for being with us, Gary. Feel free to share your screen and get started. I will be quiet, but welcome to all of our friends from all around the world. I saw somebody pop up, say they were from Naples, Florida. So welcome to all of our friends. We are so excited to have you.
Okay. Christina, thank you so much. You can hear me okay now? Okay. I want to thank you, Christina, and I want to thank the Oil Museum, not just for this, but for the many years of support and assistance that they've given me. I've written a number of books about Ontario's oil industry. You should be able to see some of them right now, I'm hoping. And if it wasn't for the assistance of the Oil Museum, those books would never have been written. Everyone there and their facilities have been just fantastic, and I thank them so much. So this year, I have published a biography on the man I think it's safe to say is the most successful of the people we call the foreign drillers. The book is called Crude Genius, and it's about this man, William Henry McGarvey. And we're tonight going to talk a little bit about the curious life of William McGarvey, an international oil baron. So it's my pleasure to share with you some of the material that I used to write Crude Genius. This is the first time I've talked in detail about what went into the creation of this book. Today, you're going to see some photos that I have never shared with anyone other than my publisher. Photos from family members and from sources in Poland, where McGarvey built his business into a tremendous empire. As I said in the title of this presentation, William McGarvey lived a curious life. He was a man of many talents. He could well have become a successful politician. He served on Petrolia Village and then later Town Council. He ran for the Conservatives in the Ontario election of 1879. And against all odds, in a very strong Liberal riding, he almost won. He came very close to winning that election. He later carried on a correspondence with Sir John A. Macdonald, and actually considered as late as 1881 running again for the Conservative Party. Certainly, he was a very charismatic fellow. He was quick-witted, he was self-effacing, and clearly in touch with the average man and woman. He was also a talented performer. He entertained audiences on the stage in Petrolia. He particularly enjoyed doing readings from classic literature. But things didn't work out quite that way. As is often the case in life, a chance incident set McGarvey on a totally different course. That chance event was a visit from England and a visitor from England. The visitor convinced McGarvey to join up on the adventure of a lifetime. And that is what brings us here today. If you've ever visited the Oil Museum in Oil Springs, you might well be aware that hundreds of oil workers from Lambton County and Kent County once traveled the world. What did they do? Well, they used the expertise they learned here to establish new oil fields. These are the people who were called the foreign drillers. That's what they called themselves. That's what the people of Petrolia and Oil Springs called them, the foreign drillers. As I said earlier, McGarvey became the most successful of those foreign drillers. So today, I'm going to introduce you all to Mr. McGarvey and to explain why I wrote a book about him. But first, a little background. It was in December of 1873 that the first Lambton oil workers went overseas to hunt for petroleum. The first of these world travelers were four men: Malcolm Scott, Josh Porter, William Covert, and Edward Cook. They traveled to Southeast Asia, specifically to the island of Java. Now, Java, you'll see, it's part of the Indonesian nation today. That's Borneo to the north, and Malaysia up in the upper left-hand corner of that map. These people were the beginning of a kind of reverse migration, Canadian diaspora, if you will, whose members shared their expertise in every oil region of the world. Yes, it was Canadians who helped to teach the Saudis how to find and drill for oil. Why did they do this? Well, because the world was going crazy over oil. Kerosene had been invented, and oil was being used to shine a new light on things. Now, chances are that since you're here with us today, you already knew some of that. But what you might not have known is that McGarvey, former shopkeeper and petroleumaire, teamed up with a British engineer and financier to establish a huge empire of oil in Eastern Europe and in Russia. McGarvey was Canada's first international oil baron and one of our country's early business success stories on the world stage. McGarvey was born in Huntington, Quebec in 1843. His family moved first to London, Ontario, and then a couple of years later to Wyoming in Lambton County, just as that region was beginning to develop its oil resources in a really big way. McGarvey set up his own general store in petroleum, and he served on town council. He did very well in oil there in Lambton County, drilling and refining it. But when he accepted an invitation to go to Europe, McGarvey experienced a whole new level of success. Now, I first stumbled across McGarvey in 1997 when I was researching my first book, Hard Oiler. But I was really not able to discover an awful lot about him in those days, and there was only a fairly small section in that book about him. But what I learned about him really fascinated me and wanted me to learn more. It wasn't until well into the 2000s that I tracked down sources and people who were able to give me the lowdown on this incredible entrepreneur. And this is when I began to learn just what an incredible story there was to be told. This is the cover of my new book. I just received it today. It had been redesigned. And so this is what the book is going to look like. It's called Crude Genius, The Making of an International Oil Baron, William H. McGarvey. And I'm told by the publisher today that he expects that it's going to go to print in a very short time, in the next couple of weeks. So in fact, much of what I learned ultimately about McGarvey and his life story came about as a result of a very unlikely character, Adolf Hitler. But we'll set that fact aside for now, and we'll find out more about this historical twist of fate later in our conversation. So the more I learned about McGarvey, the more I believed that he deserved to be much better known by all Canadians. So what took William McGarvey to Europe? Well, it all came about because of this man, John Simeon Bergheim. Bergheim was born in Jerusalem, and his father, originally Jewish, converted from Judaism to the Church of England. Bergheim went to England for his education, became an engineer and a financier. And in 1879, he traveled to Petrolia in search of oil drilling experts to join him in Europe. Now, no one in Petrolia had ever seen anyone quite like John Bergheim. He was a cultured gentleman with an Oxfordian accent. So why in heaven's name had this man traveled halfway around the world to come to Petrolia? Why? Because at that time, 1879, Canada and the United States were considered the hub of petroleum expertise. If Bergheim was going to find oil experts, he knew he had two choices: go to Pennsylvania or go to Lambton County. First, he tried Pennsylvania, but the oil business was going full speed ahead there. It was booming, with John D. Rockefeller turning it into the oil capital of the world. But they told him in Pennsylvania, you'll likely have more luck finding people in Canada. Things aren't going so well there. So up to Canada he came. Here is a photo showing Bergheim with McGarvey and a number of other foreign drillers. It's taken in Petrolia in 1879. Most of these other people eventually went to work in what was called the foreign fields. Now, I hope you can see on the right-hand corner, you might be able to read where I have written McGarvey's name over the gentleman there. That's William McGarvey. Two people over is John Bergheim. So Bergheim tried to convince McGarvey to go to Europe, where he was certain that the Canadian pole tool drilling system would be successful in modernizing oil drilling and make them both a fortune. Because the fact was that while everyone knew oil existed across Europe, in Germany, Romania, and the Austro-Hungarian province of Galicia, the methods used there were very primitive. Essentially, what they were doing was soaking up oil in blankets and wringing it into pails. Or else, if they were really advanced, scooping the crude up in ladles and boiling it down in cauldrons. These were the methods that had been abandoned in North America only 20 years earlier. North American methods now were far in advance of those in Europe. One of the reasons for that was the development of the Canadian drilling system. And it was McGarvey who perfected it. Now, if you look at this diagram, you'll see the typical oil rig that is standing over top of the oil well. And then down in the lower part of the picture, you'll see the power, the walking beam coming from the power source. And it's pulling up and pushing down and obtaining oil from the ground. The Canadian drilling system, initially, the system was used for drilling the well, and then it was used for pumping oil out of the ground. It took McGarvey 2 years to decide to accept Bergheim's invitation. And in 1881, he left Petrolia with Canadian drilling equipment, such as this, equipment from the Oil Well Supply Company, and he went to Hanover, Germany. McGarvey introduced the Canadian or pole tool drilling system to Europe. Bergheim and McGarvey met with limited success in Germany, but one day, a man from Poland came to pay a visit. His name, Stanislaw Szczepanowski. Szczepanowski convinced McGarvey and Bergheim that there was plenty of oil to be found in Galicia, which was a province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, let me just point out to you on this map, there is an arrow pointing to Galicia. I apologize that the map is in German, but you can see Galician, Galizien, it's the Galician province in the upper right-hand corner of the map of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Galicia, a province of the empire, today straddles Poland and Ukraine. The Ukrainian city of Lviv is located there, as is the Polish city of Krakow. Szczepanowski had heard about the successes of the Canadian drilling system, and he believed its ability to quickly drill to deeper depths was all that was standing in the way of Galicia and oil riches. He had high hopes for helping the people of Galicia, improving the economy and creating some wealth for the average people of the Galician province. Galicia was, at the time, the poorest province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but that was quick to change once McGarvey got there. When he went to Galicia, McGarvey was initially hired by landowners. Many of them were wealthy Polish nobility to explore for oil. Using the Canadian drilling system, McGarvey struck huge quantities of oil. He quickly accumulated so much money that he began to buy up his own land rights, built his own refineries and equipment factories, built pipelines and even railroads, and became so successful there, he became known as the petroleum king of Austria, the John D. Rockefeller of Europe. Here you see McGarvey's first refinery. It was built at Mariupol in the province of Galicia. Before long, McGarvey not only was the leading petroleum industrialist in Eastern Europe, he proved himself to be expert at locating and developing oil. His expertise and opinions were now being sought from people the world over. McGarvey's career had plenty of highlights. Perhaps one of the most interesting things about him is that just before World War I, he was called upon by the British government to advise them on oil resources and on converting their First World War ships from coal fuel to oil. They even held a royal commission to study the matter. Now, here you see a couple of cover pages of that royal commission dating back to 1912. And notice that the one on the right says, and I'll give you a close-up of that, it says, this document is subject to the provisions of the Official Secrets Act. It was not until 1964, 50 years after those hearings were held, that the reports were released to the public. The day I tracked these reports down was the day that a whole new aspect to McGarvey opened up for me. I knew for sure I had a book because I had a great story to tell. And after reading through the dozens of pages containing his testimony, I came to the belief that had the Royal Commission listened to all of McGarvey's advice, World War I might well have evolved in an entirely different way. But for once in his life, McGarvey's advice was not all taken. Some of it was, some of it wasn't. McGarvey's advice was twofold. First, he placed himself firmly on the side of those who advocated converting British warships to oil fuel. Now, that was a tough sell in Britain, given the strength of the British coal industry and its workers. But supported by a man named Winston Churchill, the government ultimately accepted that advice, and it allowed the British Navy to keep up with the advancements of the German and American navies. It was McGarvey's second piece of advice that was not accepted. McGarvey told the British that his partner, Bergheim, had been exploring for petroleum in the West African nation of Nigeria. There were early indications of success there, McGarvey said, but more exploration would be necessary. In fact, he told them that no matter how certain he or anyone else could be that there was oil someplace, you never knew for sure. Sometimes you believed there was oil someplace, and you drill and you would find nothing. So he said, I believe that it's absolutely worthwhile going to Nigeria, spending more money, and finding out for sure that there is enough oil to help you in what was expected to be the coming war, which turned out to be the First World War. But then in a shocking revelation, McGarvey let the British know that Germany had locked up the oil licenses in Romania and that Britain would not have access to that oil without a tough fight. The British had believed that they knew that Galicia oil would go to Germany, but they believed that they would have access to Romanian oil. McGarvey said, it's not going to happen. The Germans have already locked up the leases. You're not going to get in there. But Nigeria, that was a different story. If you develop your resources there, McGarvey said, you can assure yourself of a vast supply of petroleum right at home in a part of the British Empire in West Africa. The British felt that Nigeria was too speculative a risk, and they moved instead to develop the resources of the Middle East. They bought up and formed their own oil company in the Middle East. They believed the Middle East was a safer bet. However, this course of action put them in direct conflict with who? With the British, with the Turkish Ottoman Empire and their German allies. Now, I believe that had the British opted instead for Nigeria, the Middle Eastern conflict could have been averted. And as circumstances have since shown, Nigeria is an oil-rich nation today. It most certainly would have fulfilled Britain's needs of the era if the British had developed those resources back at the time. Instead, it was many years later before they really started to get serious about oil in Nigeria. Would it have changed the course of the war if McGarvey had been listened to? Well, who knows? It's all conjecture now. It's history now. But I believe it could well have done so. Now, in seeking McGarvey's advice, the British were in fact risking an international incident. How so? And how did McGarvey end up advising the British government on the eve of World War I? Well, that's an interesting story. Remember, this is 1912. McGarvey lived in Vienna in this townhouse. He and his wife, Helena, had moved into it right after it was built in 1897. And so this is where he lived pretty well for much of the rest of his life. Now, Austria was an ally of Kaiser Wilhelm and Germany. This all put McGarvey in a very dicey position. The sides were hardening in anticipation of World War. Germany, Austria, and Turkey on one side, with Britain, France, and Russia on the other. As a Canadian, McGarvey was a British subject. Austria was his adopted home and the place where he did business. He had to be very careful in Austria not to antagonize the government authorities there. The British knew they couldn't just call up McGarvey and have a conversation about who controls what oil resources, but they wanted his advice. They needed his advice. They knew that. Then came a twist of fate no one could have predicted. McGarvey's partner, John Bergheim, lived in London. Here's a photo of him in his house in London with his wife, Clara. The Bergheims were out for a ride in their car one day, not far from home, when they were involved in a crash. Now, this was, of course, in the days before seatbelts, and Bergheim was thrown from the car. He suffered severe head injuries, and he died a few days later in hospital. Now, McGarvey and his son, Fred, went to London to attend the funeral. And it was while they were at the funeral that a senior employee of Bergheim's, back from his days in Nigeria, approached the father and son. And unbeknownst to the McGarveys, this was no coincidental encounter. The man had been sent by the British government to approach the oil expert. The man whispered in his ear, "Mr. McGarvey, your country needs you," he said. It was all very James Bondish, wasn't it? Can't you imagine Judi Dench as M telling Daniel Craig's James Bond, "James, your country needs you"? And McGarvey did look very dashing, didn't they? So the man who approached McGarvey asked him to attend a meeting at the office of the British Admiralty. Again, very James Bondish. And it was at the Admiralty where McGarvey shared his advice on oil supplies and conversion of fighting ships to oil fuel. It proved to be important advice, and the whole encounter was facilitated by the untimely death of McGarvey's business partner, John Berghardt. One of those interesting twists of history. Now, I want to talk a bit about William McGarvey's family, because after all, I promised you some never before seen family photos. So in order to do that, let's head back for a moment to Petrolia. For the next few minutes, what you're going to see are pictures from photo albums that were kept by William's granddaughter, Molly. She was his last living direct descendant. She had no children, her sister had no children. So the William McGarvey family died with Molly. Now, here's a photo of Helena, who was William's wife. Helena Wesolowski, her name was. In 1867, McGarvey married this young woman. She was a young lady of Polish-American heritage who was born in Michigan. Her father was a Polish-born engineer who had been hired by the new community of the incorporated village of Petrolia to do some work. And during that time, McGarvey was a significant retailer and oil well owner in Petrolia, as well as a member of village council. And William met Mr. Wesolowski, who decided that William was perhaps a good catch for his young daughter back in Michigan. And he ended up hooking them up, and the two met in Petrolia. They engaged and became married in 1867. Now, in another twist of fate, this connection to Poland through Helena served William McGarvey very well. When years later, he set up his business empire in Galicia, where the primary language was Polish. Helena not only knew the language, she knew the culture. And that proved very valuable to the success of his business there. William and Helena had 4 children in the 1870s. The firstborn was Nellie. The second was William Jr., who contracted smallpox and died at the age of about a year old. There's no known photo of William Jr. Then came Frederick, and soon after, Mary, better known as Mamie. In the early 1880s, when McGarvey went to drill for oil in Germany, he brought his family over with him to live in Hanover. And soon after the family arrived, Nellie took ill and suddenly died. But in quick succession, Helena became pregnant again. Fearing that she was far away from home and far away from friends, Helena decided she would return to Petrolia for the birth of the child she carried. And when she returned to Petrolia, Kate was born. So the McGarvey family lived in Hanover, Germany for a while, but as William's work took him to Galicia, which was several hundred miles east, he naturally became lonely for his family, and he wanted them there with him. But Galicia was very primitive. William didn't want the family moving into the modest little cottage where he had been staying. So he built a far grander home. Now, this is the cottage that McGarvey lived in. It existed at the time that he moved there in the 1880s. It continued to exist in 2007 when I visited that area and I took this photo of the cottage. It just wasn't good enough as far as McGarvey was concerned for his family. So he built another home. Here's the house he built, a home that looks much like an English country estate. It was still standing when I visited the Krakow area in 2007. If you look closely in the lower right-hand corner, you see 3 white posts. That's the edge of the tennis court that they built at the edge of the home. Now, in this next photo, imagine that you're standing with your back to this house. This is the view that you would see in front of the house. This is the garden. It's a style of garden that the Polish aristocrats of the area built. It was a plantation. In fact, the word is used. The Polish version of plantation is used to describe this park that surrounds the McGarvey house, the McGarvey estate. And you will perhaps notice a little bit, it's hard to see, a little bit to the lower left-hand corner here, you might be able to see a bit of the tennis court. It's not terribly noticeable in the picture, but take my word for it, it's there. So William's son, Fred, and Fred's wife, Margaret, were horse lovers. And this is a photo of them setting off on their horses on the back side of the house, the side of the house that you didn't see at the Mariampolsky estate. Now, it just so happens that Margaret, Madge, she was called over the years by most people, was John Bergheim's niece. And Madge's parents both died when she was quite young. And she and one of her brothers went to live with John and Clara Bergheim. So for all intents and purposes, John and Clara were Madge's parents. Now here's a shot inside the McGarvey home. And again, it looks very Victorian, doesn't it? It's very cluttered. There's all sorts of, there's Victorian furniture around, a lot of Persian rugs, family photos. It just looks like something that you would see in a Victorian home in England in many ways. And here is a shot of the master bedroom in the McGarvey family, the McGarvey family home. Again, a lot of family photos on the walls. Now, this picture I was particularly excited about when I discovered it in McGarvey's granddaughter's collection. It's the only truly family photo I was able to discover. The only photo that has everyone, all the family members who were living at the time in it. And if you want to start at the left-hand corner, the gentleman, the lower left-hand corner, the gentleman with the walking stick is none other than William Henry McGarvey. Now behind him is his daughter, Mamie, and Mamie's new husband, Count von Zeppelin, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in a moment. Now, just behind Mamie is a young man who I could not identify, but I suspect is probably a school friend of Fred McGarvey's. Seems to be about Fred's age. That's Fred over in the upper right-hand corner with his other sister, Kate, down in front of him and slightly to his right, to your left. And directly in front of Fred and looking off to the side is William's wife, Helena. And the gentleman over in the right-hand corner of the picture with the walking stick or the cane, the elderly gentleman, is William's father, Edward. Edward's wife had died by this time, and he came over from Canada. He lived in London and came over from Canada with his grandson, Fred, to visit the family for a time around 1897. So this to me is like an amazing photo. I'm just so happy to have been able to find it, to have them all together in one picture. Now this is the, I said I was going to mention Count von Zeppelin. This is William's daughter, Mamie, and her husband. And his full name is here, Count Eberhard Friedrich Alexander Edward Joseph Ferdinand von Zeppelin. He is a nephew of the Zeppelin who created the flying ship that was used to drop bombs over Britain in the First World War. The Zeppelin family you've no doubt heard about. So this is the wedding photo of Mamie and Count von Zeppelin. Mamie divorced him in 1905. They married in 1898, I believe it was, 97, 98. And she divorced him in 1905 because he turned out to be quite the philanderer. And she never married again, but she always kept the title of Countess. She called herself Countess for the rest of her life. And I'll show you in a little while where she lived. Now, this is a photo of Kate McGarvey and her husband, Eric von Jury. He was a member of the Austrian military. You'll notice the costumes are quite different. Mamie was dressed very formally, very dignified fashion. Kate is dressed in looks like a peasant's uniform and her peasant's costume. And it really speaks to the different personalities of the two sisters. Mamie was much more formal, much more interested in going to parties and dances and that sort of thing. Kate really loved the countryside of Galicia, and this is a costume from the countryside of Galicia that she wore for her wedding. Now, as an indication of how wealthy McGarvey had become, I wanted to show you this photo of the estate or castle that he bought as a wedding gift to Mamie and Count von Zeppelin. It was called Schloss Graschnitz, which means Graschnitz Castle, and it was located south of Vienna, near the town of Graz. And it remained in Mamie's hands until she died in 1962. After that, it became a riding stable, and as far as I know, it's still a riding stable today. Now, at the time that Mamie divorced Count von Zeppelin, it was fairly common for property to go to the husband. The wife really had no rights at that time. So how did Countess von Zeppelin maintain this property? Well, William actually turned around and bought it back again. So he actually paid for it twice. He bought the estate back, gave it to his daughter, and it kind of became a place where the family went to get away from business and from the communities. It was the family compound, and it's often mentioned in letters that I came across, in diaries. There were all sorts of mentions and photos taken at Schloss Graschnitz. It was a beloved place by all members of the McGarvey family. Now, originally the McGarvey company was called Bergheim and McGarvey. And as it grew, they decided to take the company public. They called it the Galician Carpathian Petroleum Company. and moved the company headquarters to Vienna. Helena always loved Vienna, which was one of the world's leading cities at the time. And she loved the social life there, the theater, the concerts, dancing. So she convinced William that they should move there too. So again, this is the townhouse where they moved. Its address was 2 Goose House in Vienna. This is a photo that I took in 2007 when I was in Vienna. Now, unfortunately, Helena had very little time to enjoy her new life in Vienna. She took sick. William told her to head down to Schloss and take in the country air. Maybe she'd feel better there. Unfortunately, while she was there, she died in 1898. In 1905, William met a much younger woman, an English lady named Eleanor. The family might have been suspicious that Eleanor was a gold digger, given the big age difference between William and Eleanor. But they quickly became smitten by her, and they remained in contact with her for many years afterwards. Now, McGarvey had been born in the horse and buggy days, but he also eagerly embraced the 20th century technology that his work helped to develop. Here's a photo of McGarvey's first and only car, a Rolls-Royce purchased in Vienna in 1912. And speaking of William's family, I should mention that not only was his son involved in the business empire, so were 2 of his brothers, James and Albert. They were never treated as partners. They were not partners in the company, but rather as high-standing and well-paid employees. They too became very wealthy over the years. But there's a sad tale to tell about James, who was assigned to operate the Russian division of the company. I apologize for the quality of this photo. It's a photo that was taken from a newspaper from about 1912. So the image is not that good, but I wanted you to get a sense of what he looked like in 1912. James worked out of the city of Grozny, which is in Chechnya, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. By 1910, the company was making good profits, and Russia was being looked at as the successor to Galicia as the company's driving engine, because supplies in Galicia were dwindling. Oil supplies and gas supplies were dwindling. And so they were looking forward to a happier future in Russia. Grozny was a very unstable place, however. Not far away, unrest was rising as dissatisfaction with Tsar Nicholas grew. Terrorists and robbers were swooping down and attacking the various oil installations because they knew foreign company payrolls were easy pickings. They were often not very well guarded. James McGarvey's wife, Julia, had come over from England in the fall of 1911 to stay with her husband, and she quickly fell in love with the beautiful countryside around Grozny. Julia stayed through the winter. Now, one day in February 1912, James and Julia hosted a senior company employee for dinner. He had just returned from a business trip to England. The 3 of them sat down at the dinner table at James and Julia's place as the chef brought in various courses served with fine wine, of course. Suddenly, several intruders burst into the dining room. One of them quickly thrust a saber through the back of James's chair, killing him instantly. The guest jumped up to fight them off and was knocked to the floor. Julia was shoved aside and struck her head, and the intruders made off with the company's safe. Now, James died. The assistant who had tried to come to his assistance and Julia's assistance, he died. Julia survived. She went to hospital, she survived, and lived actually for many years up into the 1950s, and lived a very comfortable life on James's inheritance. Now, this is an image from a newspaper. It's actually the Toronto Evening Telegram, February 20, 1911, telling about the incident of the break-in and the killing of James McGarvey and his assistant Talbot Bernard, and the injuries to Julia. So clearly, Russia was becoming a very dangerous place. Now, as you take another look into the family album, this is William with his daughter-in-law, Madge. Remember, she was a Bergheim. She had married Fred McGarvey, and Madge's first daughter, Lila. This is a photo of William and Lila and Madge at the Mariampol estate that Fred and Madge took over after William and Helena left for Vienna. So I promised to talk about what I think is an intriguing connection between Adolf Hitler and how this book came to be. I wanted to explain why Hitler was in part responsible for my being able to write my new book at all. And here's how it came about. So you likely know that under Hitler's Nazi regime, a great deal of emphasis was placed on the purity of the German race. There was no place for people of color, no place for Jews. Anyone under suspicion of being Jewish faced danger. Now remember John Bergheim, Bergheim's partner. Bergheim's father, William McGarvey's partner. Bergheim's father was born Jewish. He converted to the Anglican Church. Bergheim's niece, as I said, who essentially became his daughter because he raised her, married William McGarvey's son, Fred. So this is Fred and Margaret of Madge in Vienna. So Fred and Margaret lived in Vienna, and Hitler took over Austria in 1938. And all of a sudden, people began to get very worried about being identified as Jewish. Fred and Margaret ended up contracting a genealogist in the United Kingdom and asked her to research Margaret's heritage to prove she was sufficiently Aryan to satisfy the Nazis. And thus began Fred McGarvey's search and research into his own family tree. The research was completed and then handed down by Fred to one of his two daughters, Molly. Now, this rather glamorous photo of Molly was taken when she performed on the stage in Vienna as a concert singer. Molly probably would have had a very good career as a concert singer, but her father, Fred, forbade it. And in those days, fathers got away with doing things like forbidding their daughters to do things. Fred said, no daughter of mine is going to perform on the stage. So poor old Molly had to give up her career. I read several reviews of her performances, and she was well thought of by the critics and reviewers. So this is Molly in later years. She died in 2002, and she was the last of William McGarvey's direct descendants, as I said before, but she was an incredible pack rat. Molly never threw anything out. Her belongings included diaries and guest books, thousands of photographs, and a family tree she created herself in the research her father and others had done as evidence of their Aryan background. And so it was because of the terrible racist laws imposed by Hitler that the McGarvey story was compiled and saved. Without this work, I would not have been able to obtain a great deal of the information I had, and probably would not have been able to finish the book. And the story of the most successful of Canada's foreign drillers would have been lost. So there you have it. I'm going to stop sharing there so you can see me again. This is a small glimpse at my research and my new book. There's plenty more in the book, stories of McGarvey's life and career, the incident that led William to call himself the lucky man. The time of his career was balanced on the flip of a hat. Truly, the story of Fred McGarvey's escape from the Nazis and Countess Mamie's recounting of how she saved her Grasnich castle from not only the Germans, but the Russians as well. These and many more stories are contained in the pages of Crude Genius. And now I'm going to turn things back over to Christina so she can moderate any questions you might have. I would be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much for listening to me ramble on. I hope you learned something of interest today.
I can't wait to cozy up with your book when it comes. I have so many questions, but before I start picking your brain, I want to open it up to our audience. You can put questions in the chat. Feel free to put questions in the Q&A. I encourage you to put questions in the Q&A so that we may be able to see them and I can relay them to Gary. This is just wonderful and a wealth of information. And while some of our participants today are formulating their questions or typing their questions, I want to ask a question that's kind of always been burning in my mind about William McGarvey. And that was, how was William McGarvey viewed by the Polish people, by the Ukrainian people, the Galatians, while he was working there? How did his employees view this Canadian British person coming in and owning the means of production, their resources?
Well, I would say much of the reason that he was as well respected and accepted as he was is thanks to his wife, Helena, who was a lady of Polish heritage. She knew the Polish language. William was never able to learn Polish. He learned German and he did business in German. He was terrible in Polish, and he joked about it actually on many occasions about how bad he was, but in a very self-effacing way. He never made light of the Polish people. He was well loved by the people who worked for him. I have photographs of William meeting the people. He loved to come to his various installations, his factories, his refineries. He loved to meet the people who worked for him. And by all means, by all indications, they had very high regard for him. There's a lot of details in the book about the sorts of very forward-thinking improvements and changes McGarvey made to the lifestyle of the people and to the working conditions of the people. I don't have time to get into the details, but he really contributed a great deal to the society in which he lived, and he was very highly regarded as a result of that.
That's so interesting for me to hear, because we always hear about colonialism and that there are people, expats, British, American, Canadian, going to international locations and basically setting up little enclaves. Like this is the expat enclave, or the British American Club, or the Canadian American Club, where there was this separation. But from what you're describing is that McGarvey really integrated within society through the help and the negotiation and smoothing over of his wife, Helena, which is fascinating to me.
Actually, he once said, when he was referred to essentially as what in the Americans would call a carpetbagger, someone who came in to just take over, some foreigner, some imperialist coming over, he said, "I didn't come with foreign money. I came to contribute and to make money here. I came to be part of your community."
Did he use Helena as a translator with some of his business dealings or dealings with the local population?
I don't know if I can say much about that, other than now a lot of the people that he was very wealthy, and other wealthy people around him were Polish princes and that sort of thing, who would have spoken very good English in most cases. So he didn't have to worry about that. No, in terms of dealing with his workers who would have been speaking Polish and Ruthenian and Russian, I can't really say whether she helped him in that regard. I don't know for sure. Good question.
So we have a question in the Q&A. Did you ever get to interview his daughter, Mamie? So Lorraine has this question. Did you get to interview Mamie at any point?
No, Mamie is the one, his daughter died in 1962. So I was only 11 years old at that time. I didn't get to interview her. Unfortunately, I really, really, really regret that I was not able to talk to his granddaughter, who's the lady who lived until 2002, his granddaughter. I did the second best thing though. I made contact with and have become friends in a sense with a cousin of Molly's, who to this day lives in England. He's a retired reverend, and he knew Molly very well. And he was the recipient of a lot of Molly's materials. He's the one who had all of the fabulous photos that Molly collected, the family trees, the diaries, letters. He had all of that material. So while I didn't get to meet a direct descendant of William, I kind of feel like I got to meet the second best thing. I also talked to a couple of this fellow's cousins who were also cousins of Molly. So I was in touch with members of the McGarvey family. Incidentally, I should say, I believe that one of your people who's listening tonight is also a descendant, not a descendant, that wouldn't be the right word. He's a distant relative of William McGarvey. He's not a descendant because he was connected to William about 2 generations before William. So I want to say hello to him. Hello, Pete, if you are listening. I think you're involved tonight, and that's about it. So
we have another question. How did you find that guy?
Which one? You mean the Reverend?
Yeah, the Reverend.
Let me see. It's been so long. I think I put out, I went looking through British phone books for people named McGarvey. And one of those McGarveys got me in touch with the Bergheim, with someone who was related to the Bergheims. So they were not directly involved with William McGarvey, but I think it was like a friend of a friend of a friend. And then all of a sudden the contact was made and we started emailing one another. And wow, I think I've known him probably now for about 12, 15 years. We've been
amazing how just playing telephone tag can get you these amazing stories, and the stories involving World War I and these contributions. And I'm hoping in your book, if you can enlighten us a little bit, give us a little bit of a teaser about McGarvey, what happened to McGarvey's estates and his company at that. So he lived only till, I believe you said 1914. So he
Yes.
was really involved in these touchy political situations where his daughter had married in and now divorced, and he's a British subject. And what was that kind of relationship in world geopolitics involving the First World War, where everybody hates everybody?
Yes.
And he's advising the British Admiralty and Winston Churchill, but he's sitting in the middle of the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
It was a very dicey situation for him, and other Canadians, including some of McGarvey's friends, were placed under house arrest. I don't believe any of them were interned, but many of them were placed under house arrest and prevented from working during the First World War. William died soon after the First World War began. It was right after, it was the night of his 71st birthday. He died that night of a heart attack. Now, what had happened, the war began in September of 1914. He died in November of 1914. During that time, the Russians invaded Galicia and pushed back the Austrian troops and destroyed many of William's installations. They burned to the ground some of his oil fields and refineries. And there is some of that. There's a lot of that in the book as well. But when William died, he believed that his business empire had been destroyed. It hadn't. Fred was made the leader of the head of the company. And he was eventually, after the Russians were pushed out of Galicia, he was given responsibility for trying to rebuild the company as best he could. Now, he did an incredible job of doing that. By the end of the war, he had put together as much of the company as he could. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the future of the company was Russia. But what happened in Russia by that time? The revolution. And all of the foreign oil companies had been nationalized by the communist regime. So they lost. And
there are
everything.
Other stories here at the museum about people escaping the Russians and the flight from Grozny and the starvations and hiding and pretending to be a Cossack to get back to the UK. Right. And eventually most of those families made their way back to Petrolia. And we have those stories. If you're looking for a story, come see us here at the Oil Museum.
That's right. So to end this in as short a time as I can, so you can get on to another question. So William thought he was broke. He wasn't. His family was actually quite well off. Fred, by the end of the war, decided that he'd had enough. He'd rebuilt the company as best he could, and he started selling off pieces to other people, to other companies. And all of this left Fred and his two living sisters with a great deal of money. They were very, very wealthy, and they lived the rest of their years very well off. And then the two sisters did not have children. Only Fred had children. He had two daughters. Neither one of those daughters had children. So that's how the McGarvey line ended in 2002. But the two daughters of Fred, they were very well off too. And Molly, the last one, when she died, I can't recall the value of her estate, but it was up in the millions of pounds when she died in 2002. And she gave most of that money actually, to animal welfare organizations. She was an animal lover. She had no children, so that's what she did.
She loved her fur babies. Well, this is all so exciting, and I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. We had a lot of thank yous in the Q&A. Everybody really appreciated it. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to dive into your book. And what I want to do is encourage all of those people to come back. We have another lecture happening in conjunction with Lambton Heritage Museum about the environment and sustainability within the oil industry. How did the public really view the oil industry here at this period of time, the 1860s, 1870s, right into the early 1900s, and we kind of touch on the St. Clair Blob. So one of the things is we want to encourage you to take a look. On behalf of the Oil Museum of Canada, I want to thank Gary so much for being our guest speaker this evening. This talk was so fascinating. Gary, next time you show up at the museum, you probably won't get to leave because I have more questions. Because I find this story really changes how Canadians view themselves and the impact they had on the international industry and world politics.
Yes.
Like really, truly, Winston Churchill, the evolution of World War I and how that bleeds into World War II. And how do we understand and move resources? Plus the Red Scare. Fascinating stuff. In the meantime, I want to encourage everybody, thank you for joining us. We encourage you to check out our YouTube channel. This conversation will be available on YouTube in the next couple days. Give us a little time here at the Oil Museum. We hope to see you again for our next virtual talk. There will be a talk June 2nd with Lambton Heritage Museum about the environment and the oil industry. And in the meantime, check us out, come for a visit, and keep your eyes peeled. We'll let you know here at the museum when Gary's book is available for purchase.
Very soon.
Thank you very much. I'm going to end it there, friends. Have a great evening. So I'm going to stop recording.